organisms of the same species that live together in the same area. And so that's a population. And we know that evolution itself, which is a change over time, evolution acts on populations. However, the main mechanism we do by which this happens is natural selection, although it's not the only one that can affect evolution. Natural selection is where you have members, individuals of a population which have certain characteristics, phenotype, which allows them to survive better and reproduce better than other members of the same population that do not have those characteristics. So, and so natural selection is pretty much a driving force of most evolution and changes. Blow this up a little bit here. All right. The first thing that you have to have in order to have the possibility of evolution and natural selection is that you have to have genetic variation that is inheritable, it's passed on. And genetic variation has to be there so that you have differences on which can be selected for in terms of being in the environment. So the first concept of the second chapter is, and really read these concepts because they're important to understand. They're a big statement in themselves. Genetic variation makes evolution possible. All right, now, you go back to meiosis. You learned about meiosis 1, how from prophase to metaphase of meiosis 1, the tetrads line up together. The homologs and their chromatid or double chromatids from DNA replication, they line up together. And when they line up, they can arrange it so either the paternals are on the left, which came from the father, or the maternals are on the left. Each tetrad lines up independently, right? And then there can be crossing over between the inner two, the inner paternal and the inner maternal. And those are two processes that occur in meiosis to generate a shuffling or a mixing. Like a shuffling of the genes. Let's see. Those are sources of genetic variation that are generated through meiosis. And just the whole act of independent assortment alone, because we have 23 tetrads that line up in the middle, because we have 46 chromosomes, just the lining up of the tetrads is a 1 in 8 million chance that they'll ever line up the same way twice. And then the prediction of the crossing over is not easy. And then the third item from that is random fertilization. This unique egg combines with this unique sperm. So we are definitely unique and probably have never been and probably never will be another person just like us. The closest to that, of course, is if you're an identical twin. And then you have the same genetic makeup, but the environment can still act on you differently, and you're still a different person, even though you share the same genotype. Now, remember in genetics, we talked about alleles are contrasting forms of the same trait. Like a big T for Mendel's pea plants, a big T is a dominant allele for tall, and little t would be a small allele for recessive trait. And it takes two recessives in order to have the full phenotypic expression of the short variety. Well, just keep in mind that all of that stuff generates new combinations of genes, and the gene pool has all of the alleles of the population in it. Now, evolution or natural selection cannot act on things that aren't there. Okay, so if there's an event that happens, for instance, the wildfires, the terrible wildfires in California that we've had, the populations of different organisms have been greatly reduced. And if there may just be a few of a certain population of whether it's a plant or whether it's an animal, that may not be representative of the frequencies of the phenotypes that were originally in the population prior to the disaster. We're actually going to have a bottleneck situation. Yes. Yeah. Yes, there. Very good. Thank you. It's what we call genetic drift. It's where there's a drifting away from the main population, and that the type of genetic drift this is a bottleneck, which occurs when you have just a small number of individuals that are now going to be represented. But before we get back into that, also just remember there are some organisms that reproduce really rapidly, and those would be the bacteria by binary fission, which is an asexual type of reproduction. Although there can be some change in genetic material. And so sexual reproduction is the main thing that contributes to the genetic variation. However, talking about alleles again, what process that's spontaneous and unpredictable generates new alleles? What? Mutation, thank you. So all genetic variation, all the alleles originated by a mutation, which is a sudden change in genetic material. Could have been caused by, of course, a mutagen, which causes mutations, could have been caused by X-rays, could be caused by, all kinds of things that just happen. Now, if it happens in our arm or a main part of our body, we're not going to pass it on. But if it happens in the sex cell, then those can be passed on. All right, so number 2, big concept. The Hardy-Weinberg equation. You math lovers, you're going to love this. Okay, the Hardy-Weinberg equation can be used to test whether or not a population is evolving. Substitute the word evolving for changing. Is the population changing? Is the allelic frequency changing? Are the genotypic combinations changing? Well, remember the gene pools. If you take the gene pool of this population right here in this class, you put all the alleles for all the different genes of all of us in the swimming pool, this gene pool, and then we're obviously not reproducing within this particular population, but if you were reproducing, then you only have what's in the gene pool that can be exchanged and utilized. So the gene pools of population, all existing alleles at the gene loci. Loci is the position of the genes. They can be either have dominant alleles or recessive alleles, or a combination of both, which is heterozygous. There's an equation for alleles at a locus, and it's up there, and we think about P as like the dominant alleles plus the recessive alleles, and together they make up 1. Obviously, we're going to be dealing here with percentages, which would be if something is 0.50 times 100% would be 50%. Okay, so you could do that. So if Q, now this is just alleles, if Q is equal to 0.60, what is P? What was that? 0.40. Okay, so 0.40 plus 0.60 equals 1. This is part of the Hardy-Weinberg equation. However, it gets a little more complicated than that. This is just the alleles. Now, the genotypic combinations is something else. But before we get into the genotypic frequencies, Hardy-Weinberg, let's go back and say what it is an equation that can be used to test whether or not a population is evolving, changing. Okay. What are the 5 conditions that have to be met in order for a population to be stable and not evolving? If any one of these 5 is the opposite, then you can bet it's evolving. Do you know how hard it is to keep these 5 conditions? It rarely happens in nature. But, okay, no mutations. Can you control the universe in terms of whether or not mutations happen? It's very, very, very difficult. Okay, no mutations. Random mating. There is mating between the 2 sexes, totally at random, with no bias and no prejudice and no sexual selection. There's not a preference for blonde hair. There's not a preference for height. There's not a preference for anything. It's just random mating. Do you know how likely that is? Probably not really. No natural selection. Oh, right there, there's a biggie. That certain traits, whether or not there's going to be a selective force there. And must have large population, bigger than this room. The larger the population, the more likely it could be stable, because you've got more random mating mixing. But when you start getting into small populations, it can get skewed very easily. And no gene flow back and forth between populations. In other words, the people who live in Milford City would not be allowed to interact or reproduce with anybody in Miami Township or Batavia or Eastgate, any of these areas. The people in Milford City could only reproduce with the people in Milford City. Now, we're obviously not talking people, because that's not ethical. We don't control who mates with whom in terms of humans. So, but put that to any particular animal or plant, that's what that would mean. There's no gene flow back and forth between different populations. of organisms. Do you know how likely that is? Unless there's a what would be a something physical that could stop a population from having gene flow?
Being on an island.
Being on an island. Islands are fantastic. Fertile offspring. Yes. That's the biological definition of a species. So we're going to be getting into speciation. So populations tend to remain stable and allelic and genotypic frequency stable if all the following not occurring in the population. So those are the conditions which we just went over. Not a likely proposition, but it is a test as such. Okay, now, how about the genotypic frequency? So you have homozygous dominance, 2 big T's. You have heterozygotes, which would be 1 big T, 1 little t. And then you would have homozygous recessives, which would be 2 little t's, right? Well, this equation look familiar, sort of. P squared plus 2tq plus q squared. This is the true Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium constant for genotypic, predicting genotypic frequencies. The p squared is equal to the homozygous dominant, the 2pq is the heterozygous, the q squared is the homozygous recessive, and possibility of some problems that could be asked for you to work. And there's the equation. If you're asking for genotypic frequencies, you use this one. If you're asking for a simple allelic frequency, you use that one. So, let's see if I get this. Actually, if we go to the end of this sheet, on the back, I do have a couple problems. What would be the end? It's an allelic, it's asking for alleles. What would be the frequency of the Q allele in number 1? 65% is the P allele. 35%, right. So this one's the easy one. Now this gets a little more different. In a population of acacia trees, some of them are short, which is the small homozygous. So that would be, what, Q squared? And 84% are tall, which would include both the homozygous and the heterozygous. What are the frequencies of the 2 alleles? Well, Q squared, this really should be a small q. Q squared is equal to 0.16. Square, okay, Q is equal to 0.4, right? And then, so P plus Q equals 1, so P is equal to 0.6. So that's pretty simple. Now, solving, now if we solve this and ask for the genotypic predictions, P squared is 0.6 squared plus 2 times 0.6 times 0.4 plus Q squared equal to 0.4 is going to be squared equals 1. And then if you work all that out, you end up with this. So this would say 36% of them would be homozygous dominant, 48% of them would be heterozygous, and 16%, I forgot the dot, 0.6% would be the homozygous recessive. So there they are, right? So that's how you work them. have a lot on the exam, but I'll probably have a couple of them of Hardy-Weinberg. Definitely know the conditions that have to be met for the population to be evolving. Okay, so let's go back to this. Number 3, natural selection, we know all about that. Genetic drift, we've mentioned, and gene flow can alter allelic frequencies in a population that can lead to a speciation event, which can form a new species. Genetic drift. What is genetic drift? I've tried to give you some of these definitions I actually got out of your glossary, so don't forget your glossary at the back. Genetic drift is a process in which chance events cause unpredictable fluctuations in allele frequencies from one generation to the next. The effects of genetic drift are most pronounced in small populations. They're much more pronounced in small populations, so we usually equate genetic drift with small populations. And can lead to a loss of genetic variation and can cause harmful alleles to become fixed. Two types. Okay, Aaron just told us about one earlier, and it was about the bottleneck effect. And it's a type of genetic drift that occurs when the size of the population is reduced as by natural disaster or human actions. Typically, the surviving population is no longer representative of the original population, so now you have whatever phenotypes are left, they're going to be the ones magnified and continue to reproduce. So the whole genetic variations and everything will be different. And the second is the founder effect. So when you talk about genetic drift, you usually talk about bottleneck and founder effect. And founder effect, genetic drift that occurs when a few individuals become isolated from a larger population and form a new population whose gene pool composition is not reflective of that of the original population. And I mean no disrespect whatsoever, but they're really a good example, and it's like the Amish population in general. And the Amish tend to only stay with other Amish people. Okay, and then in terms of marriage and having kids, they're marrying within this gene pool, very small gene pool, as compared to a total random mating situation. And so, for instance, polydactyly, which means more than 5 digits, could either be on toes or hands. Polydactyly is a dominant trait. So it only takes one big key to have polydactyly. It has a it's really not that frequent, and I'm sorry, I don't remember offhand exactly what the frequency is, in a total population. But in the Amish population, it's very frequent because that's a part of the gene pool. It's in the gene pool, and it's a dominant trait, and so it's got to be expressed even more. And there are other diseases and other phenotypes which are similar. This is a sort of isolated population where they founded their own population. They kind of selected the people. And so that you can have kind of a skewed representation of different traits. If these happen to be recessive traits that are potentially harmful, you can see this could be a problem because they can pop up more. And let's also mention the royal family of Europe, particularly from Queen Victoria times. When we studied genetics, we talked about color blindness, and we also talked about hemophilia and Duchenne's muscular dystrophy are three sex-linked traits that are inherited on the X chromosome. And hemophilia is much more frequent, or was anyway, in the royal family than it was in the general population. Because there were individuals within the royal family who had the hemophilia, and it's carried on the X chromosome. And I apologize if that's me. Get this turned off like it's supposed to be. My apology. Oh, come on. You never do anything easily. Sorry. I can see who it's from. My dog gets groomed in the morning. All right, so I have a Maltipoo. He's the most adorable dog in the world, of course. But he has hair, which is good because he doesn't shed. But he also has to be groomed every 5 weeks because his hair really grows fast. So anyway, he's cute. He's my son. Anyway.
You should bring him in one day.
Yeah. Oh, he would love it. He loves people. He's a domesticated dog. I mean, he's definitely a people companion dog. Yeah. So, anyway, the royal family of Europe could almost be a little bit of an illustration of the founder effect too, because there's a selective breeding, a crossing between only, usually anyway, until more modern times, we now have Meghan Markle, who's not completely, not from royal family bloodlines. And I don't mean any disrespect by saying that, but that's, that used to be a big deal. But in terms of genetics, it's much healthier this way. So, and gene flow, the transfer of alleles from one population to another, resulting from the movement of fertile individuals or their gametes. So, and then the gene pool, I just want to define some terms for you. And speciation, the evolutionary process by which one species splits into two or more species, and for some reason can no longer reproduce with each other. We will be talking about pre-zygotic barriers and post-zygotic barriers. There could be that is changed in the mating patterns, that they no longer want to mate with each other. There could be something that they change the food that they eat, and so their seasons are different for when the particular fruit is available. And so one tends to mate at a different time than the others. They don't mate with each other. Some pre-zygotic, zygote being, of course, the union of the egg and the sperm. And then post-zygotic barriers. Sometimes something happens even once they have fertilized and they no longer develop, which leads to speciation. We're going to throw this into adaptive radiation. Period of evolutionary change in which groups of organisms form many new new species whose adaptations allow them to fill different ecological roles in their communities, also called divergent evolution, as opposed to convergent evolution. So adaptive radiation is where you have a common ancestor and then you radiate outward new species that come from a common ancestor. And this is a typical pattern. And a niche is or niche, is probably the more sophisticated way to say it, a niche. And, is the role a species plays in an ecosystem as producers, primary consumers, whatever role they play, scavengers, decomposers, and its behavioral responses to the environment. So this is a little more detailed than that original sheet I gave you is, right? A little more. Okay, fourth concept. Natural selection is the only mechanism that consistently causes adaptive evolution, which is adaptive radiation also. Adaptive evolution that occurs as a better match between the organism and their environment. Everybody read that? Adaptation, inherited characteristics of an organism that enhances its survival and reproduction in an environment. Like in lab today, we did the white moth, black moth, camouflaging, predation, experiment. Natural selection, a process in which individuals that have certain inherited traits tend to survive and reproduce at higher rates than other individuals because of those traits. One has relative fitness. We're not talking about exercising fitness. We're talking about the contribution of an individual that makes a gene pool of the next generation relative to the contributions of others. Okay. There are three different modes of natural selection. Based on the chosen phenotypes. I would like for you in your textbook, and I think I put the number there, didn't I? Yeah, page 492. I would also like for you to be able to look at a graph and to be able to tell me which is stabilizing, which is disruptive, and which is directional. Now, the overall concept is that, you know, you have extremes. Okay, let's just do this. You have an extreme down at this lower end. You have an extreme all the way up at this end. And you have intermediates in the middle. All right, in terms of natural selection, which is selected for, directional is one end is favored over the other end. That makes sense? It could be either end, but one end is favored over the other. Disruptive favors the ends of both extremes and selects against the one in the middle. So they select against the ones in the middle, which means those are not favored, but both extremes are favored. That's disruptive. And then you have stabilizing, which acts against both extremes and favors the middle. Favors the middle. So those are three different modes that natural selection can happen depending upon the situation. And so it would be good to also look at the graphs. All right, next, the key role of natural selection is adaptive evolution. And natural selection is the only one that consistently leads to adaptive evolution. You know, we talked about gene flow and genetic drift also contributing to evolution. But of the three, natural selection is the only one that consistently leads to the adaptive evolution. Now, under that particular category, and I mentioned this before, sexual selection, a lot in sexually reproducing organisms, particularly animals, well, not animals, but not just higher animals, but even some of the lower invertebrates, you actually have mating rituals. You have sexual dimorphism, which means males look different than females. And oftentimes, males, particularly with birds, perfect example, the males are bright plumage. Peacock spreads his feathers, they're beautiful. And he does his little courtship thing. And actually, the female kind of makes the choice as to which male she wants. So this is part of natural selection, this whole sexual selection thing. There's also competition within males for the female, intrasexual. Intersexual between the male and female, mate choice, mate selection, to see who gets to pass on the genes. So this sounds very animalistic, but it's kind of the way it is. Now, whether or not this also happens with humans to some extent, well, there's probably some sexual selection, right, going on as well. There's also a balancing selection where some individuals have a heterozygote advantage. If you talk about sickle cell anemia, people who are heterozygote for these sickle cell anemia, if they live in a malaria-prone area, are resistant to malaria. I can't tell you why, but they are. Sometimes the heterozygote advantage is real. It's almost like saying, what's your best, healthiest dog? It's a mutt. It's one that's the hybrid of everything. It's because the Heinz variety, he used to say, because they probably have more heterozygous tendencies for different traits. Whereas when you get more the purebred, there's a lot of stress in the breeding situation in terms of trying to have particular traits that they want to fulfill. And sometimes you have breeders that are not real scrupulous, and sometimes there's some inbreeding within the family tree, and to try to maintain certain characteristics. And sometimes you end up with a wired, this crazy dog, that's or super hyper or other characteristics. Why natural selection cannot fashion perfect organisms? Okay, let's just do it this way. True or false? Evolution is perfect. False. Evolution is directed. False. There's a lot of chance it happened. The environment changes, that can change the whole selection forces. Okay. What are some of the limiting problems here? I mentioned this earlier. Selection can only act on existing variations. If you don't have a particular gene in the gene pool, you're not going to be able to predict. Unless there's a spontaneous mutation that's going to be a really big coincidence. All right, so existing variations. It's limited by historical connections. In other words, you have descendancy of one of the historical connections between the species and the common descendants. You've got all those genes that are present, and that can influence, of course, what kind of genes you end up having. Adaptations are often compromises. So we're not saying adaptations are perfect, but they're often compromises. But again, if the environment changes, it's like out there in California, plant and animal species, particularly plant, they're going to have to become more resistant to fires because the fires are becoming so common. So the species of plants that are out there are probably the ones that are more resistant and are able to come back after a fire are going to be the one. Chance, look at this, chance, natural selection, and the environment interact together. So what we have in evolution is really a combination of the three. Chance, that's natural selection, and what environment, what the environment presents. So, okay, we were really, let me just introduce this for a few minutes. Terrence's, your sheet, which I put on Blackboard, chapter 24. And I did add some to it because he was at a disadvantage because he had to do it so quickly. And again, I really appreciate you doing this. So, what should we know about the origin of species? And Darwin even said, this is the mystery of mysteries, how species develop. And I'm just going to hit high points, and then you need to study with the textbook and study with this. But the biological species concepts emphasizes reproductive isolation. And it can or cannot be a geographical barrier. And there will be reproductive isolation. And this is where it talks about pre-zygotic barriers and post-zygotic barriers. Your book has some illustrations in there which are very helpful. The biological species definition, a group of individuals of the same kind that are capable of interbreeding and producing viable, fertile offspring. Okay. Common sense example. If you want to go into mule farming, you want to raise mules, how do you go about it? Hmm?
A horse and a donkey make meals?
A mule is a hybrid. It is an interspecies thing. You actually can get a horse and a donkey to mate. And they are really different species. They have a lot of similarities, but they're different species. They will mate, and they will produce offspring, and it's called a mule. But it is sterile.
I was gonna say, you can't continue the generation, have to start back over from a horse and a donkey.
Absolutely. So you're going to have to cross horses and donkeys to get mules because they do not have fertile offspring. So that is a hybrid with its limitations of not being able to reproduce. But mules and donkeys. This is the part I wanted to just point your attention to. Speciation to take place with or without geographical separation. Okay, the geographical separation, such as the Grand Canyon that I spoke about earlier, is called allopatric speciation. Allopatric. Other country. If you're a patriarch of your country, okay, allo means other. Okay, other countries. So they have geographical barrier between them. That's allopatric speciation. The other type is called sympatric, which is the same country. And there are examples of organisms that even live on the same tree, like insects that live on the same tree, that they were once one species, but they've actually diverged into two different species, even living in the same tree. And so then you get into the questions of how can that happen? And that's called sympatric speciation as to how that occurs. Okay. So on Friday, are we supposed to have a quiz on Friday or not? No. Oh, that's what I was gonna do, is give you back your quizzes, and I still can't. Okay. Let me make sure. No, we're a little bit behind, so we're gonna take the origin of species and then go into phylogeny, so C24, C26. And let me see where this is. Actually, we did pretty decent. Go ahead and volunteers to just yell out names. Please don't turn these papers over, just yell at people's names real fast. Thank you.